The river water churned with sudden violence. Church members gasped as Pastor Gerald Thomas, a 64-year-old preacher from Tennessee, pressed the widow's head under the cold current. At first, they thought it was just part of the baptism, but seconds stretched into a full minute. Her arms thrashed in panic, bubbles rising to the surface. "Pastor, she's struggling," someone shouted. But Gerald's grip only tightened. His voice boomed across the banks. "This is God's will. She must be cleansed fully." The widow's screams became muffled gurgles. Her hands clawed at his arms. Her eyes, wide with terror, pleaded for mercy. But the pastor did not let go. Then stillness. The water rippled, but her body no longer fought. The onlookers stood frozen, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. Whispers broke out. Cries of horror filled the air. And then silence. Was this truly God's will? Or had the congregation just witnessed a murder at the hands of the very man they trusted with their souls? The town of Ashwood, Tennessee, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business. A quiet community where Sunday service was a highlight of the week, and Pastor Gerald Thomas was a heart of it all. Gerald had been leading the First Baptist Church for over 3 decades. To the townspeople, he was a man of strong faith, strict morals, and commanding presence. Some admired him deeply, while others whispered about his temper when he thought no one was looking. On the other side of town lived Mary Lou Parker, a 58-year-old widow. Mary Lou had lost her husband 2 years earlier to a sudden heart attack. The grief weighed on her every day. But she was known for her kindness, the way she baked pies for neighbors, and how she always checked in on the elderly in her community. Still, Mary Lou carried loneliness like a shadow. She began attending every church event, hoping faith would heal her broken heart. It was there that she fell under the guidance of Pastor Gerald. At first, Gerald seemed like a comfort. He preached about new beginnings, about letting go of sorrow and trusting God's plan. He visited Mary Lou at home, offering prayer sessions that lasted long into the night. He told her the water of the river could cleanse more than just her sins. It could cleanse her grief too. Mary Lou believed him. The town buzzed with excitement when Gerald announced he would perform a special riverside baptism for her. Neighbors whispered that it might mark a fresh chapter in her life. "Maybe she'll finally smile again," one woman said. Children played by the banks as the congregation gathered. Everyone dressed in Sunday best despite it being Saturday. The day was bright, the sun glinting off the rippling river. The choir sang softly as Gerald led Mary Lou, dressed in a white robe, into the water. Her steps were hesitant at first, but she looked peaceful, hopeful, even. She trusted him. What no one knew was that Gerald carried a storm inside him. As the ceremony began, his voice rang out over the crowd. He prayed, his hands firm on her shoulders. "Mary Lou, today you will be reborn," he declared. She closed her eyes, whispering a final prayer. Then he lowered her into the water. At first, it was normal, just as every baptism had been before. But as seconds passed, people began shifting uncomfortably. Gerald's hand pressed harder, holding her beneath the surface. Mary Lou's body started thrashing. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Let her up," someone screamed. A teenage boy took a step forward, but his father gripped his arm. Nobody dared challenge the pastor outright. Not yet. Gerald's eyes were wild, his voice booming. "The Lord demands her soul." And in that chilling moment, the peaceful baptism turned into something unholy. The congregation froze between faith and fear, not knowing if they were watching a divine act or a crime unfolding before their eyes. Would anyone be brave enough to step forward? Or had Mary Lou Parker just taken her last breath under the hands of the man everyone trusted most? The screams started after the silence. Women rushed to the riverbank, skirts dragging in the mud as they tried to reach Mary Lou. Children began to cry, some burying their faces in their mother's arms. A few men shouted at Pastor Gerald, but he stood firm in the water, clutching the lifeless widow as though he had just performed a holy miracle. "She's gone," one woman wailed. "Pastor, what have you done?" Gerald's face remained stone cold. He raised his hands toward the sky and bellowed, "The Lord has spoken. She is with him now." The congregation was split between horror and shock. A handful clapped uncertainly. still caught in the spell of their pastor's authority, but most backed away, whispers of murder circling like vultures over the scene. Finally, two men stepped into the water, prying Mary Lou's body from Gerald's grip. They dragged her ashore and laid her on the ground. A nurse who had attended the service rushed forward, performing chest compressions, begging for signs of life. But the river had already taken her. Someone called 911. Within minutes, sirens pierced the calm Tennessee air. Sheriff deputies, paramedics, and a medical examiner swarmed the riverbank, their radios crackling with urgency. The congregation scattered in confusion, some lingering to watch, others hurrying home to whisper what they'd seen. Sheriff Daniel Harris, a man in his 40s with sharp jaw and weary eyes, stepped onto the muddy ground. He had been sheriff in Ashwood County for nearly a decade, and he'd seen plenty of tragedy, but never anything like this. He knelt beside Mary Lou's body, her white robe clinging to her frame, hair plastered to her cheeks. The nurse shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "She's gone." Daniel rose, his gaze shifting to Gerald, who still stood waist-deep in the water, hands clasped like a man in prayer. "Pastor Thomas." Daniel called out firmly, "I need you to come out of the river." Gerald's eyes opened slowly, his expression calm, almost smug. "Sheriff, I did God's work. Her soul was chosen." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Step out of the water now." As deputies waded in to escort him out, Gerald did not resist. Instead, he lifted his head and whispered loudly enough for all to hear, "The Lord will punish anyone who questions me." The word sent shivers through those gathered. Back at the bank, Daniel questioned witnesses. One by one they spoke, some trembling, some angry, some still confused. "He held her under," one man said. "Too long." Another added, "She was fighting him. That wasn't no baptism." Still, a handful defended Gerald. "You don't question the pastor," an older woman muttered. "He knows God well better than we do." This divide made Daniel uneasy. In small towns like Ashwood, a pastor held more influence than even the law itself. Mary Lou's body was carefully bagged and taken to the county morgue for autopsy. As the van drove away, the weight of the scene pressed down on everyone. But Daniel knew this was only the beginning. When he returned to Gerald, the pastor met his gaze without fear. "You will now understand what happened today, Sheriff," Gerald said, voice steady. "But soon everyone will." Daniel narrowed his eyes. "Maybe, but until then, Pastor, you'll have to answer to the law." The deputies placed Gerald in handcuffs, the metallic click echoing over the river. Gasps rose from the crowd, as though they couldn't believe anyone would dare restrain their spiritual leader. Some cheered quietly. Others turned away, tears of conflict staining their cheeks. As Gerald was led toward the patrol car, he turned back to the river, murmuring under his breath, "The water will speak again." Daniel felt a chill. He had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize the look in Gerald's eyes. This wasn't just faith, this was obsession. And obsession, he knew, could be deadly. That night, as news of the baptism spread like wildfire across Tennessee, the town of Ashwood split into two camps. Those who believed the pastor was a murderer, and those who swore he was a prophet carrying out God's will. And Sheriff Daniel Harris realized he wasn't just investigating a drowning. He was about to walk into a storm of faith, fear, and fanaticism that could tear the whole town apart. Would the autopsy reveal Mary Lou's death as murder? Or would Gerald's claim of God's will leave investigators trapped between truth and belief? The morgue was cold, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly as the medical examiner leaned over Mary Lou Parker's body. Sheriff Daniel Harris stood nearby, arms crossed, trying to mask the heaviness pressing down on his chest. He had seen death before, but something about this case felt different, more sinister, more personal. Dr. Evelyn Carter, the county medical examiner, lifted her gaze from the autopsy table. "Sheriff, this was an accident. She didn't just slip under the water." Daniel's jaw clenched. "What did you find?" Evelyn removed her gloves, tossing them into a bin, bruising around the neck and shoulders, consistent with someone holding her down. Water in the lungs confirms drowning, but the pressure mark suggests force. She fought back. The words confirmed what Daniel already suspected. It wasn't God's will. It was murder. But proving that in Ashwood was another matter. The next morning, Daniel walked into the station, greeted by a flood of phone calls and reporters clamoring for answers. Did Pastor Thomas kill her? They demanded. Why would he do it? His deputies looked overwhelmed, juggling the chaos. Daniel motioned for Deputy Carla Simmons, his most trusted partner, to follow him into his office. We need to be careful, he said as he shut the door. This isn't just about evidence. Half this town worships the man. If we move too fast without solid proof, we'll have a riot on our hands. Carla nodded, and the other half already wants him strung up. Exactly. Ashwood was split right down the middle. Families were fighting at dinner tables. Some church members swore Gerald was chosen by God. Others called him a murderer hiding behind Scripture. Daniel rubbed his temple. He understood the grief. He had buried his wife years ago, cancer taking her before her time. That same helplessness he had felt then was written all over Mary Lou's family's faces when he spoke to them. They wanted justice. They wanted answers. And Daniel wasn't about to let them down. The investigation kicked off with interviews. First was Elaine Harper, Mary Lou's best friend. She sat trembling at the station, hands clutching a worn tissue. Mary Lou just wanted peace, Sheriff, she said softly. She trusted Pastor Gerald. She thought baptism would help her let go of her grief. She never thought he'd hurt her. Did she ever mention anything unusual about him? Daniel pressed. Elaine hesitated. He started visiting her often, said he was helping her pray. But Mary Lou told me, sometimes his words scared her. He said God had big plans for her, that she was chosen. She laughed it off, but I could see it worried her. Daniel jotted it down. To him, it sounded like manipulation. Then came the church elders. They were less cooperative. Pastor Thomas is a man of God. One snapped. If he held her under, then that was the Lord's will, not murder. Daniel bit back his frustration. Faith was blinding them, twisting what they'd seen. The search of Gerald home uncovered more questions than answers. Inside his study, they found a journal filled with strange writings. Passages of Scripture, but altered. Phrases circled, words crossed out, rewritten with chilling clarity. One line stood out. Through water, the chosen shall rise. If they do not rise, they were never worthy. Carla read aloud, her face pale. Sheriff, this sounds like he planned it. Daniel flipped through more pages, each more unsettling than the last. It was as if Gerald believed drowning was not death, but a test of faith. But then came the first major setback. The defense attorney Gerald hired wasted no time. At the first hearing, he argued, my client did not commit murder. He performed a baptism in accordance with his faith. The unfortunate drowning was an accident, nothing more. To Daniel's frustration, some townspeople agreed. Outside the courthouse, protesters carried signs, "Free Pastor Thomas," and "Don't criminalize faith." The case was slipping into dangerous territory. Faith versus law. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the evidence spread out before him. His daughter, Emily, now a college student home for the weekend, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Dad, you look exhausted." He sighed. "This case, it's tearing the town apart. Half of them think I'm the villain for arresting their pastor. The other half wants me to lock him away forever. And the truth is, I don't even know how deep this goes." Emily's voice was soft. "Mom used to say truth always rises, like oil and water. Maybe you just haven't seen it yet." Her words gave him pause. Maybe the real answers were still hidden. The following week, a witness came forward. A young woman named Tara Mitchell, who had been baptized by Gerald months before, walked into the station trembling. "Sheriff," she whispered, "I need to tell you something. When he baptized me, he held me under too. I thought I was going to die. But when I came up, he said, 'God chose you.' I was too scared to say anything." Daniel leaned forward. "Tara, are you saying this wasn't the first time?" Tara's eyes filled with tears. Mary Lou wasn't the first. She was just the first who didn't come back up. Daniel felt his stomach drop. This wasn't just one act of violence. It was a pattern. And if Tara was right, how many others had nearly drowned at the hands of Pastor Gerald Thomas? The revelation from Tara Mitchell shook Sheriff Daniel Harris to his core. If Pastor Gerald had been holding people underwater during baptisms before, then Mary Lou's death was not an accident. It was inevitable. But when Daniel brought the testimony to the prosecutor's office, he was met with hesitation. "Sheriff," Assistant DA Martin Lewis said, adjusting his glasses, "do you realize how hard this will be proved in court? You've got a medical report that says drowning. You've got witnesses, yes, but they're divided. Half of them say it was murder, half call it faith. And now you're telling me there's a pattern? Without solid numbers, without more victims coming forward, we're fighting a losing battle." Daniel slammed his fist lightly on the desk. "Then we find the victims. If Tara was too scared to speak up, how many others are out there?" Martin sighed. "Just be careful. This isn't just about evidence anymore. This town is on edge. If we push too hard, people may riot." Back in Ashwood, the divide was wide. The church congregation split into two factions. One side demanded justice for Mary Lou, holding candlelight vigils outside her home. The other stood firmly with Gerald, hosting prayer circles where they declared his arrest a persecution of the church. Families were being torn apart. Siblings stopped talking. Neighbors refused to share meals, and whispers of violence filled the air. Daniel could feel the pressure in every corner of town. He tried to keep his deputies focused, but even inside the department, arguments broke out. One deputy, who grew up under Gerald's preaching, flat out refused to believe the pastor could be guilty. Carla Simmons, however, was relentless. "Sheriff," she said one evening, laying fresh files on his desk, "I tracked down old church records. Gerald baptized over 200 people in the past decade. That's a lot of opportunities for something to go wrong. But here's the thing. I found 3 hospital reports. People treated for near drownings, all within days of their baptisms. No police reports, though, just brushed off as accidents." Daniel's eyes narrowed, or covered up. Carla nodded grimly. They began reaching out to those who had been hospitalized. The first was James Ellison, a farmer in his 70s. He sat on his porch, weather hands shaking as he smoked a pipe. "Yeah, I remember," he said slowly. "When Pastor baptized me, I blacked out. Woke up with people slapping my back. Thought it was my own fault. Weak lungs, maybe. But sometimes I wonder if he meant to keep me under." The second was Carla Jenkins, a young mother who had been baptized as a teen. Her eyes filled with fear, she recalled. "I thought I was dying, Sheriff. He didn't let me up. When I gasped for air, he whispered, 'Now you're truly reborn.' I was too scared to tell my parents." Each story added weight to the case, but also stirred something darker. Fear of what Gerald really believed. Meanwhile, Gerald himself sat in county jail, calm as ever. Deputies said he spent hours praying aloud, scrawling scripture on scraps of paper, and preaching to anyone who would listen. Some inmates were drawn to him, convinced he was a prophet. When Daniel finally sat across from him in the interrogation room, Gerald smiled faintly. "Sheriff Harris," he said in a slow drawl, "you're chasing shadows. The Lord works in ways you cannot understand." Daniel leaned forward. "You drowned Mary Lou Parker. You held her under until she stopped fighting. That's not God's will, that's murder." Gerald's eyes glimmered with something unsettling. "What is death, Sheriff, but a doorway? She was chosen. You should be thanking me for guiding her through." Daniel felt his skin crawl. "You're not a prophet, Gerald. You're a killer hiding behind scripture." Gerald chuckled softly, leaning back in his chair. "We'll see who history remembers as a sinner." Despite the mounting evidence, resistance was fierce. One Sunday, as Daniel drove through town, he saw dozens of people kneeling in the street, blocking traffic, holding signs that read, "Release our shepherd and God over law." Some shouted insults at his patrol car, calling him a heathen, a persecutor, even a devil. That night, rocks were thrown at his home. His daughter, Emily, screamed as glass shattered across the living room floor. Daniel rushed her into the back room, fury boiling in his chest. This was no longer just about justice. It was about survival for him, his family, and the town. The breaking point came a few days later. Carla burst into his office, pale and breathless. "Sheriff, you need to see this." She handed him a letter, freshly delivered to the station. It was written in shaky handwriting and signed. "I know what Pastor Thomas did. I was there years ago. Meet me, and I'll tell you everything. But you can't trust anyone. He still has followers who will do anything for him." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Finally, a breakthrough, a real witness who might expose everything. But at the bottom of the letter, scrawled in red ink, were 3 words that made his blood run cold. "Water will rise." Was this a genuine lead that could crack the case wide open, or a trap set by Gerald's fanatical followers? Sheriff Daniel Harris sat at his desk long after midnight, staring at the letter under the harsh glow of his desk lamp. The words "water will rise" replayed in his mind like an echo he couldn't escape. It could be the breakthrough he needed, or the beginning of something far worse. Deputy Carla Simmons leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Sheriff, this feels off. No signature, no name, just a warning. What if it's a setup?" Daniel rubbed his forehead. "I know, but if it's real, it could blow this case wide open. If someone's been holding the secret for years, we can't ignore it." Carla frowned. "Then we do it careful. No going alone." The letter directed them to an abandoned farmhouse outside Ashwood, on the edge of the river. Its broken windows and sagging roof gave a haunted look, especially under the pale light of the moon. Daniel and Carla arrived just after dusk the following evening. The place was silent except for the chirping of crickets and the distant rush of the river. "Stay sharp," Daniel whispered as they stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the dust. The air smelled of mildew. Floorboards creaked under their boots. For a moment, it seemed empty until a figure stepped from the shadows. It was an older woman, frail but alert, her eyes darting nervously. "My name's Ruth Callahan," she whispered. "I used to be part of Gerald's church, years ago. I saw things I should have reported then." Daniel's breath caught. "Ruth, what did you see?" She swallowed hard. "He's been doing this for years, holding people down. Some didn't fight. Others nearly drowned. He called it a test. Said if you came back up, you were chosen. If you didn't, it was God's decision." Carla leaned forward. "So you're saying Mary Lou wasn't the first death?" Ruth hesitated, then shook her head. "No, she was the first people saw clearly. But I think others, people who disappeared, they didn't just vanish. They were baptized." The word sent a chill through the room. "Names, Ruth," Daniel urged. "Do you remember anyone?" She nodded slowly. "2 at least. A drifter named Caleb who came through town, and a young woman, I think her name was Lorraine. Both baptized, both gone soon after. Families never got answers." Daniel's heart pounded. If true, Gerald wasn't just a killer. He might be a serial predator hiding behind the church. But before Ruth could say more, the sound of shattering glass exploded through the farmhouse. A brick crashed onto the floor, wrapped in cloth. On it, in jagged writing, were the words, "False prophets burn." Ruth screamed. Carla drew her weapon, scanning the windows. But whoever had thrown the brick had already melted into the dark. Daniel grabbed Ruth's arm. "We need to get you out of here now. You're not safe." They hustled her to the car, the night suddenly alive with the sound of footsteps retreating through the brush. By the time they reached the station, Ruth was shaking uncontrollably. "He still has followers," she whispered. "They'll kill me if they know I spoke to you." Daniel promised her protection, but inside, he felt the weight of what just happened. Gerald's reach extended far beyond the jail cell. His believers were watching, listening, ready to silence anyone who stood against him. The next morning, Daniel presented Ruth's testimony and the brick incident to the DA. "This is bigger than one drowning. We've got a pattern, a motive, and now threats to a witness. We need to treat this like organized crime, not just one murder." But Martin Lewis, the DA, looked weary. "Sheriff, you're building a case that paints Pastor Thomas as a cult leader and serial killer. That's huge. If we fail to prove in court, you'll make him a martyr. His supporters will never let you live it down." Daniel slammed the table. "Then we make sure we don't fail." Later that week, as Ruth was moved to a safe house under deputy guard. Daniel drove to the county jail to see Gerald again. The pastor greeted him with a calm smile. "Sheriff, how's your faith these days?" Daniel ignored the bait. "People are talking, Gerald. Old baptisms. Missing people. You want to explain that?" Gerald's eyes gleamed. "Every chosen one must pass through water. Some rise, some don't. That's not murder, it's destiny." Daniel leaned in, his voice cold. "Destiny doesn't leave bruises, Gerald. You did this. And when I prove it, no scripture will save you." But Gerald only laughed. "Prove it, then. You'll see, water always rises." That night, as Daniel drove home, he spotted something that made his blood freeze. Spray painted across the side of his house, in dripping white letters were the words, "Gods who cannot be jailed." Emily, his daughter, rushed outside in tears. "Dad, they know where we live. What if they come back?" Daniel pulled her close, fury and dread boiling inside him. It wasn't just a case anymore. Gerald's followers were watching his every move, and they were closing in. Was Ruth's testimony the crack that would finally bring Gerald down, or had she just put a target on all of their backs? The spray-painted words on his house still glowed under the sheriff's porch light the next morning. "Gods who cannot be jailed." Daniel Harris had dealt with criminals before, drug runners, drunks, and the occasional violent outburst. But this was different. This was faith twisted into a weapon, and it was turning the whole town into a battlefield. Emily sat at the breakfast table, her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. "Dad," she said quietly, "maybe you should step back. These people, they aren't thinking straight. What if they hurt you? Or me?" Daniel knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I can't step back. If I do, Gerald wins, and more people will get hurt. I lost your mother once. I'm not losing you, too." Her eyes filled with tears. "Then promise me you'll be careful." "I promise," he said, though he wasn't sure he could keep it. At the station, Deputy Carla Simmons looked grim. "Sheriff, we got a problem. Word spreading that Ruth is under protection. Some folks are calling her a liar. Others are saying she's possessed. The safe house feels compromised." Daniel cursed under his breath. "We move her again. Keep the location tighter this time." Carla hesitated. "That's not all. We had reports of masked men scaring off people who speak against Gerald. Vandalism. Threats. One woman says her dog was killed and left on her porch as a warning." Daniel's stomach churned. He's orchestrating this from behind bars. That afternoon, Daniel visited Ruth at the safe house, a small cabin tucked deep in the woods. She looked exhausted, pacing the room. "They're coming for me," she whispered, clutching her arms. "I can feel it." Daniel tried to reassure her. "You're safe here. Deputies are watching." A loud bang rattled the windows. Gunshots. Deputies scrambled outside, returning fire as a pickup truck sped off, its headlights bouncing through the trees. When the dust settled, Ruth was on the floor, shaking violently. "I told you," she sobbed. "He still controls them." Daniel knew then Gerald Thomas was more than a murderer. He was the leader of something closer to a cult. Back in town, tensions exploded. On one side, protesters held signs demanding Gerald's release. On the other, mourners marched for Mary Lou Parker, demanding justice. The two groups clashed outside the courthouse, shoving, shouting, nearly rioting before deputies broke it up. News trucks rolled in, plastering Ashwood's chaos across Tennessee and beyond. Commentators debated whether Gerald was a prophet or a predator. The case had gone national, and every move Daniel made was under a microscope. The weight crushed him. Late one night, he sat alone in his office, staring at Mary Lou's photograph, her soft smile, her kind eyes. He thought about Ruth, living in fear, about Tara, who nearly drowned, about the missing names she had given him. And then he thought about his daughter, sleeping in a house that no longer felt safe. He felt powerless, like the river itself was dragging him under, just as it had dragged Mary Lou. For the first time in his career, he wondered if he could win this fight. Carla found him slumped over his desk the next morning, eyes bloodshot. "You need rest," she said gently. "I need answers," he muttered. "We've got a killer in jail, and he's still running this town. Witnesses are scared silent. Evidence keeps getting twisted into scripture. Every step forward, we're shoved 2 steps back." Carla pulled up a chair. "So what do we do?" Daniel stared at the wall, his voice low. "I don't know." It was his darkest moment. The point where every lead felt like a dead end, every witness seemed like a target, and every night brought new threats. That same evening, as he drove home through the winding country roads, Daniel's headlights caught something by the riverbank. He slowed, heart pounding. Spray painted on a large rock were the words, "The river claims its own," and below it, a crudely drawn cross. He stepped out of the car, the night air thick and damp. The river whispered in the dark, as though mocking him. He knew Gerald's people had left a message for him. But then his flashlight caught something else, half buried in the mud. A shoe. Daniel's breath caught. He pulled it free, and next to it, he saw what looked like fabric, part of a torn dress. It wasn't Mary Lou's. It was someone else's. Another victim. Had Gerald's followers led him stray to evidence of another murder? Or was the sheriff about to be dragged deeper into a trap designed to destroy him? The muddy shoe sat heavy in Sheriff Daniel Harris's hand as the river whispered around him. His flashlight beam trembled over the torn fabric half buried in the silt. He bagged the evidence carefully, his gut twisting. This wasn't just vandalism or intimidation. This was a message. Gerald's followers wanted him to know there were more victims. By the time Daniel returned to the station, dawn was breaking. Carla was waiting with 2 cups of coffee, bleary-eyed but alert. "You look like hell," she said. Daniel placed the evidence bag on her desk. "Found this by the river. Shoe and part of a dress. Not Mary Lou's. Could be Lorraine's. Or Caleb's. Maybe someone else." Carla's eyes widened. So Ruth was telling the truth. Daniel nodded. "We're not just dealing with one murder. Gerald's been hiding bodies in plain sight, under the river." The breakthrough lit a fire in Daniel. For days, he and his deputies combed the riverbanks, dragging nets and probing the muddy depths. The townsfolk watched from a distance, some cheering them on, others praying against them. Then, 3 days in, the water gave up its secret. A skeletal hand emerged from the mud, tangled in weeds. Deputies gasped as divers pulled a waterlogged body onto the shore. Then another, and another. By the end of the week, 3 sets of remains had been recovered. One matched Caleb, the drifter Ruth had mentioned. Another was a young woman, likely Lorraine. The third was still unidentified. But the message was clear. Gerald's baptisms had claimed far more lives than anyone imagined. Daniel and Carla sat across from Gerald in the interrogation room once again. The pastor's shackles clinked as he leaned back, smiling faintly. "You found them, didn't you?" Gerald asked, his voice calm, almost proud. Daniel slammed photos of the recovered bodies on the table. "You call this God's will? You drowned them like animals. How many more, Gerald?" Gerald's eyes gleamed. "As many as the river demanded. I didn't choose who rose and who didn't. That was the Lord's work." Carla's voice shook with disgust. "You're not a prophet. You're a predator. And now the whole world will see it." But Gerald only laughed. "The world will see what it wants to see. My flock still believes. They will rise, Sheriff. Just wait." And rise they did. That night, dozens of Gerald's followers gathered at the courthouse, chanting hymns and waving Bibles in the air. Some carried torches. Others carried signs. "Trust God, not man," and "Gerald is innocent." The crowd surged against the barricades, shouting Daniel's name with venom. Deputies in riot gear held them back. But the atmosphere was thick with danger. Inside, Daniel watched from the courthouse steps, his heart pounding. Carla stood beside him, whispering, "They'll riot if we push harder." Daniel's voice was steady. "Then we don't push. We finish this. Tomorrow we go public with the evidence. No more whispers. Everyone sees the truth." The next morning, Daniel stood before cameras, holding up the recovered evidence. Mary Lou Parker's death was not an accident, he declared, nor was it an act of God. It was murder, one in a long string committed by Pastor Gerald Thomas under the guise of faith. We have recovered multiple bodies from the river. We have testimonies from survivors. This is not prophecy. This is predation. The press erupted. Some townsfolk wept openly. Others screamed in protest. Gerald's supporters shouted curses at Daniel, while Mary Lou's family clung to each other, finally hearing the words they had prayed for. But even as the truth began to take hold, Gerald's influence struck again. That evening, a deputy rushed into Daniel's office, pale and frantic. "Sheriff, you need to see this." On his desk, the deputy laid down a Bible. Inside, scrawled in red ink, was a single message: "The final baptism comes soon. The sheriff will drown." Daniel's blood ran cold. The case wasn't just about bringing Gerald to trial anymore. His followers were planning something, and the target was him. Would Daniel uncover their plan in time, or was the river about to claim one final victim before justice could be served? The message inside the Bible burned in Sheriff Daniel Harris's mind. The final baptism comes soon. The sheriff will drown. He had faced criminals before, but this wasn't just crime. It was fanaticism. Gerald Thomas might have been behind bars, but his followers were still carrying out his will, ready to spill more blood. Daniel gathered his deputies that night. "We need to assume they're planning to make good on this threat. They'll want the river. It's always been the river." Carla Simmons tightened her jaw. "Then we get ahead of them. Stakeouts, patrols, double shifts. We don't let them get close." But deep down, Daniel knew the only way to end this was to face Gerald one last time. The courthouse was packed for the trial. Families of victims filled one side of the room, Gerald's supporters the other. The air buzzed with tension, every word from the judge echoing like thunder. The prosecution laid out their case. The autopsy proving Mary Lou was forced under, Ruth Callahan's testimony about missing victims, survivors who described near drownings, and the remains pulled from the river. Piece by piece, the image of Pastor Gerald shifted from a man of faith to a man of obsession and death. When Gerald was allowed to speak, he rose in his orange jumpsuit, chains rattling. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Daniel. "These deaths," he declared, voice booming, "were not murders. They were God's trials. I am his servant. And you," he pointed straight at Daniel, "you are the enemy of his work." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some supporters shouted amen before the judge slammed his gavel. Daniel sat still, unflinching, but his heart pounded. He could feel Gerald's grip on the crowd. Even now, the jury deliberated for hours. Outside, tensions boiled. Gerald's followers gathered by the river, singing hymns, some carrying ropes and banners. Deputies formed a line to hold them back. Just after midnight, the verdict came: guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of multiple counts of homicide, life in prison without parole. The courtroom erupted. Mary Lou's family wept, clinging to one another. Supporters of Gerald wailed, some collapsing to the floor. Gerald himself smiled faintly, whispering, "The river will rise again." 2 nights later, Daniel received the call he'd been dreading. A group of Gerald's most loyal followers had gathered at the river, chanting about a final baptism. Deputies raced to the scene, sirens cutting through the night. When Daniel arrived, torches lit the riverbank. Dozens stood in the shallow water, their voices echoing. "The river cleanses. The sheriff must be washed clean." One man broke from the crowd, charging toward Daniel with a knife. Shots rang out. Deputies dropped him before he got close. Chaos erupted. Some followers fled into the woods. Others fought deputies in a frenzy of blind faith. When it was over, several were arrested. The riverbank lay silent, the torches smoking. The spell was broken at last. Months later, the town of Ashwood began to heal. The church closed its doors, its pews gathering dust. Families returned to Sunday dinners without arguments tearing them apart. At Mary Lou Parker's grave, Daniel stood with her family. Fresh flowers covered the headstone. Her sister whispered, "Thank you, Sheriff. She finally has justice." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. She deserved better. All of them did. As he walked away, his daughter Emily took his hand. "It's over now, Dad." He looked toward the river in the distance, the water glinting in the sun. For the first time in months, it looked like just a river again, not a weapon, not a grave. But Gerald's words still echoed in his mind. The river will rise again. Daniel knew fanaticism never died easily, but as long as he wore the badge, he would stand against it. Pastor Gerald Thomas was sentenced to life in prison, stripped of his pulpit and his following. His name became a stain in Tennessee's history, a reminder how faith can be twisted into something deadly. Mary Lou Parker's death, once shrouded in confusion, was now marked as a murder that exposed years of hidden violence. For Ashwood, healing would take time. But for Sheriff Daniel Harris, one truth remained steady. Justice had risen, just as the river had once claimed. And this time, justice would not drown.